75 years of marriage, yet choosing to live miles apart in their twilight years. The tabloids branded it a fractured marriage, but Princess Anne has just shattered the rumours with a stunning revelation. Living apart wasn't a failure of the marriage, but rather love's highest achievement. The fiercely ignorant public possessed a painfully limited comprehension of the Duke's relentlessly vast portfolio of patronages. For an absolute eternity, the kingdom's rabid press corps feasted upon a fabricated narrative that the palace elegantly starved of oxygen. The undisputed monarchs of British matrimony, handcuffed by sacred vows for a staggering 75 years, were allegedly existing in entirely separate postcodes. They were not simply occupying opposing wings of a gilded fortress, nor retreating behind the impenetrable oak of adjacent aristocratic suites. Instead, they were supposedly stationed miles apart. The sovereign anchored the relentless constitutional circus, whilst her husband vanished to an unremarkable agricultural dwelling on the fringes of a Norfolk estate. The ensuing gossip was utterly merciless. The desperately gullible populace demanded hysterical answers to a crisis that never actually existed. Enter Princess Anne, the monarchy's resident pragmatist, wielding the blunt instrument of truth to completely shatter this pathetic illusion. Her brutal clarification fundamentally dismantles every sordid little lie the gutter press ever sold about the union of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. Abandon the hysterical fabrications. The unvarnished reality is significantly more devastating to the tabloid industry's bloated ego. To dissect this mass delusion, one must rewind the royal spectacle back to 2015. Prince Philip, the fiercely loyal Duke of Edinburgh, executed a manoeuvre previously unthinkable in the rigid, sycophantic annals of the firm. At the ripe age of 95, having endured an astonishing 20,000 solo masquerades across a punishing 60 years, the man finally slammed the door on public servitude. A solo royal engagement like this. They won't use the word officially, but in effect he's retiring from the role he's played in public life for more than 60 years. Digest that colossal statistic for a fraction of a second. That is not a mere vocation. It is a draconian sentence of lifelong duty, so astronomically vast that it defies basic peasant logic. The hopelessly romantic masses naturally assumed he would quietly decay upon a Buckingham Palace throne or wither gracefully within Windsor Castle beside his spouse of 75 years. That is, after all, the painfully conventional script for pensioners staggering towards the finish line. Prince Philip, however, viciously rejected that mediocre retirement plan. He decisively absconded to Wood Farm, a delightfully unpretentious 6-bedroom rustic bolt hole buried deep within the Sandringham estate. He was stationed miles away from the crushing gravity of the sovereign's endless state paperwork. There were no cavernous ballrooms. There were no suffocating battalions of liveried servants. There were absolutely no gold leaf ceilings to oppress his morning coffee. It was merely a timber-beamed rural sanctuary staring blankly at the sea. This brilliant domestic downgrade sent the paparazzi into an absolute unhinged frenzy. Royal rift. Philippe, abandon palace, 75 years of marriage, and now this. For more than 7 decades, Prince Philip stood dutifully behind his wife in the longest marriage in British royal history. Yet, not a single cowardly hack possessed the journalistic spine to confront the glaringly obvious counter-narrative. What if the ink-stained gossips were monumentally, historically incorrect? What if this geographical divorce was not a symptom of terminal matrimonial decay? What if it was a masterclass in profound emotional maturity that utterly eclipsed the intellectual capacity of the gossip columns? Princess Anne has explicitly confirmed this aristocratic flex. It exposes a heavily guarded high society tradition that entirely baffles the suffocatingly codependent working classes. To properly digest the wood farm emancipation and Princess Anne's ruthless clarification, we must brutally yank the timeline back to 1945. The genesis of Philip and Elizabeth's thoroughly unapologetic living arrangement did not spontaneously materialise in their twilight years. It was practically stamped into their marriage certificate when the newlyweds seized the keys to Clarence House in 1950. They absolutely refused to share a sleeping chamber. This was not a suppressed scandal. It was certainly not a symptom of aristocratic frigidity. In their elite stratosphere, banishing your spouse to a separate mattress was simply the default setting. Lady Pamela Hicks, Philip's own cousin and the Queen's loyal courtier, laid bare this phenomenon with unapologetic bluntness. She essentially translated the elite British doctrine of segregated sleeping quarters, proving it was born from extreme practicality rather than marital frostbite. You don't want to be disturbed. You don't want to compromise the quality of your rest. But, and this is the crucial part, the aristocracy fundamentally grasped that making a deliberate choice to endure one's spouse is the pinnacle of genuine romance. This was never a frigid standoff. It was a spectacular masterclass in self-preservation that pathetic modern therapists are only just starting to comprehend. Affection does not demand suffocating, relentless physical attachment to survive the decades. Two sovereign individuals can remain fiercely devoted whilst desperately craving glorious isolation and absolute silence from one another. Their chambers at Clarence House were conveniently adjoined by discreet connecting doors. They could merge their existences whenever the mood unexpectedly struck. They were simply absolved from the grim bourgeois obligation of mandatory nightly spooning. This glorious architectural loophole shadowed them across the entire kingdom. Buckingham Palace possessed the requisite connecting suites. Windsor Castle upheld the grand tradition of partitioned sleeping. From the Scottish chills of Balmoral to the sprawling grounds of Sandringham, every single palatial fortress they commandeered for 75 staggering years, starting from their 1,945 nuptials until his demise in 2021, strictly adhered to this protocol. Therefore, when the Duke finally fled to Wood Farm in 2015, he was hardly launching a violent marital coup. He was merely stretching a fundamental boundary that had dictated their union from day one. He was fiercely executing the doctrine that devotion thrives phenomenally well when one simply grants the other a monumental amount of geographical breathing room. Princess Anne, having been raised entirely within this spectacularly detached dynamic, comprehended the brilliance of it better than any weeping tabloid editor. Wood Farm was the rustic enigma the royal PR machine desperately hoped the public would simply ignore. Let us brutally dissect this specific estate, because it was far more than a pile of bricks. It was an unfiltered lens into the man Prince Philip actually was, stripped of the suffocating medals, the absurd protocol, and the obsessively curated public facade. Planted firmly on the Norfolk dirt of the Sandringham estate, this 6-bedroom timbered refuge sits roughly 3 miles away from the suffocating grandeur of the main house. It stares blankly at the ocean. It is aggressively silent. By the ludicrously opulent standards of the firm, it is a frankly shocking exercise in peasant mediocrity. Upon seizing the keys, the Duke did not merely unpack his tailored suits. He ruthlessly gutted the interior to reflect his own untamed psyche. He dictated the installation of a functioning culinary space. He aggressively plastered the walls with his own amateur watercolours. He entirely commanded the redesign of the 6 sleeping quarters to suit his brutally specific whims. One must pause to calculate the sheer psychological weight of that autonomy. Here was an alpha male who for over 7 suffocating decades had been trapped in museums designed by dead monarchs and polished by an army of invisible servants. He had been a prisoner of ancient decrees that micromanaged his every physical footstep and dictated his sartorial choices for every tedious ribbon-cutting ceremony. He had dutifully trailed exactly 3 paces behind his spouse at every single public masquerade. He had violently strangled his own formidable intellect and masculine ambition to play the eternal understudy to the globe's most recognizable female. Yet suddenly, at the grand age of 95, buried within a 6-bedroom rustic hovel in Norfolk, he finally possessed a kingdom of 1. It was a fortress decorated with his own questionable art, cluttered with his own literature, and entirely dictated by his personal eccentricities. He obsessively painted those watercolours, a dormant passion violently resurrected after 60 years of suffocating public servitude. He devoured books with a ravenous appetite. He allegedly cultivated a wildly unpredictable truffle farm in the surrounding muck. He actually invited breathing human beings to visit, an undertaking that the paranoid, hyper-formal machinery of Buckingham Palace rendered completely agonizing. The most devastatingly rebellious detail, however, was the dress code. The staff at Wood Farm operated entirely without the medieval humiliation of brass-buttoned uniforms. Within the theatrical circus of the firm, this detail was practically an act of high treason. The entire monarchical grift relies on archaic visual hierarchies and stiff collars. At Buckingham Palace, every pathetic footman is defined by a rigid title and an uncomfortable jacket. Wood Farm violently eradicated that nonsense, allowing actual human beings to simply exist without performing. Then there were the sovereign's clandestine visits. She descended upon the property with a frequency that would have given the Fleet Street vultures a collective aneurysm. She did not perch upon a velvet throne whilst terrified courtiers peeled her grapes. She actually engaged in domestic labour. The supreme ruler of the Commonwealth reportedly stood at a cheap metallic sink in a rural backwater, violently scrubbing her own supper plates. That utterly bizarre visual fundamentally short-circuits the brain. It obliterates every falsehood ever published about this estate. Wood Farm was never a coward's retreat from a decaying vow. It was rather disgustingly the truest, unfiltered manifestation of their entire marriage. Princess Anne is now ready to testify. The core of this aristocratic melodrama has finally detonated, sending absolute shockwaves through the ranks of obsessive royal historians. Princess Anne, a woman notoriously allergic to performing cheap sentimentality for the paparazzi, has weaponized her signature bluntness. She has aggressively defended her bloodline's domestic reality with a brutal frankness that is simultaneously shocking and entirely predictable. The Princess Royal maintains that the brain-dead public and the malicious press entirely butchered the narrative of her parents' dynamic. This infantile tabloid theory of an icy estrangement was not merely factually void. It was a grotesque insult to a couple who had flawlessly engineered one of the most fiercely loyal alliances in modern geopolitical history. Her brutal clarification is delightfully simple. The geographical chasm between Buckingham Palace and Wood Farm was never a symptom of emotional rot. It was a spectacular monument to profound, unyielding mutual respect. The sovereign was bound to an occupation that did not afford the bourgeois luxuries of weekends off or casual retirement. Her sovereign mandate was terrifyingly literal. The grinding cogs of the British state demanded her physical subjugation to endless prime ministerial audiences and suffocating state banquets. Elizabeth was chained to this relentless constitutional treadmill at the tender age of 21 and never once dared to step off. Her husband, conversely, had categorically paid his dues in blood and utter boredom, earning an absolute mandate to finally rest. Anne's dissection of her father's monumental sacrifices is a potent cocktail of fierce admiration and tragic reality. The Duke violently surrendered a stellar naval trajectory that he legitimately adored. He ruthlessly castrated his own generational expectations of patriarchal dominance, accepting his fate as an eternal shadow. For well over 7 decades, he plastered on a diplomatic smirk, shook sweaty peasant hands, and feigned interest in dreadfully dull charities simply because the firm demanded it. He swallowed his pride and executed this theatrical subservience without a singular public grievance. By the time 2015 rolled around, the man was entirely depleted. The ultimate revelation here is that the sovereign rewarded this lifelong subjugation with the most intoxicating prize imaginable. She granted him absolute freedom. This was not a cowardly escape from their marital vows, but a glorious emancipation within them. He was finally allowed to inhale oxygen without a royal courtier, dictating the precise rhythm of his breath. Elizabeth did not merely tolerate this rural exile. She aggressively championed it, recognizing his isolated sanctuary as the purest manifestation of mature devotion. This is the unvarnished truth the Princess Royal has violently dumped upon the press. Maintaining entirely separate postcodes was not a tragic matrimonial collapse. It was their absolute crowning glory. It served as empirical proof that after 75 years of relentless scrutiny, they still possess the psychological depth to honour each other's sanity. One must cynically wonder how many suffocating modern romances could genuinely claim such enlightenment after nearly a century. To comprehend the Duke's obsession with Wood Farm, one must dissect its heavily stained floorboards. This was not some randomly acquired aristocratic shed. It was a property violently saturated with decades of Windsor folklore, alternating between elite hedonism and spectacular tragedy. The firm officially annexed the cottage back in 1970. Philip personally commandeered it as a desperately needed detox clinic for royals suffocating under the oppressive grandeur of Sandringham House. Over the ensuing half-century, it evolved into a shockingly private vacuum where the monarchy could temporarily unlace their suffocating corsets. Prince Charles notoriously utilised the grounds to host elitist shooting massacres during his academic years, clinging to the rural hideout well into his painfully prolonged adulthood. The tragically doomed Princess Diana was stashed there before her formal engagement, back when her royal narrative still masqueraded as a saccharine fairy tale. Even Catherine Middleton, the current Princess of Wales, was dragged to the cottage during her courtship with Prince William, acting as a crucial litmus test for her future integration into the firm. However, Wood Farm harbours a gloriously grim skeleton that the royal PR machine furiously attempts to bury. In the dark ages of 1920, King George V and Queen Mary executed an unimaginably cold piece of aristocratic housekeeping. Their defective youngest offspring, Prince John, was plagued by intensely humiliating epileptic fits. Since his neurological glitches rendered him entirely unsuitable for public parades, the Crown ruthlessly banished the boy to Wood Farm. He was surgically excised from the primary bloodline to protect their flawless aesthetic. The exiled prince rotted in that isolation for 3 solid years. He inevitably perished there in 1923 at merely 15 years of age. It remains a grotesquely uncomfortable historical footnote that clashes violently with the cottage's modern reputation as a cosy sanctuary. Yet, in true aristocratic fashion, the estate simply swallowed that traumatic demise. It relentlessly continued its function as a sterile decompression chamber for monarchs desperate to escape their golden cages. By selecting it for his twilight isolation, The Duke was intentionally retreating into the belly of his own family's twisted history. He had personally terraformed that land decades prior. It was the only postcode in the entire realm that actually felt like a home rather than a tax-funded constitutional museum. Then, the apocalypse of early April 2020 abruptly derailed the entire arrangement. The COVID-19 plague blitzed through the British Isles with a ferocity that utterly terrified the ruling class. At a staggering 100 years old, Prince Philip was essentially a walking bullseye for the Grim Reaper. He was an ancient artifact equipped with a failing aristocratic heart, his legendary stamina finally collapsing under the weight of a century. The brilliant geographical divorce that had functioned flawlessly since his 2015 escape was instantly obliterated. The epidemiological threat level simply rendered his rustic isolation entirely suicidal. Consequently, the Duke unceremoniously abandoned Wood Farm. He fled directly into the fortified walls of Windsor Castle, merging his existence with the Queen's for the first time in an absolute age. They were suddenly cohabiting with relentless, inescapable daily permanence. The obsequious royal biographers later branded this sterile aristocratic quarantine the HMS Bubble. It was an airtight, highly sanitized biosphere, isolating the supreme monarchs from the diseased peasant masses, hacking their lungs out beyond the medieval ramparts. One must aggressively confront the sheer absurdity of this scenario. Here was a duo hitting the terrifying century mark, shackled by holy vows for over 75 staggering years. They possessed entirely segregated sleeping quarters, entirely different postcodes, and utterly disjointed daily schedules. According to the hysterical tabloid lexicon, this was the absolute zenith of a fractured, loveless sham. Yet, the absolute millisecond, genuine apocalyptic peril manifested, all logistical borders evaporated. There was zero bureaucratic negotiation and absolutely no cowardly hesitation. The Duke simply abandoned his rural isolation and bolted straight back to Windsor to fortify alongside his sovereign. The breathless television anchors would eventually narrate his funeral from those very grounds, broadcasting live from the historic fortress where the couple actively chose to confront global uncertainty as a unified front. Does that geographical pivot resemble a rotting matrimonial corpse? It violently contradicts the narrative, serving instead as the ultimate blueprint for an indestructible alliance. They endured that terrifying lockdown in a state of unprecedented, unhurried intimacy. They were completely severed from the grinding, soul-crushing machinery of state duty. Whilst the Duke's ancient biology was inevitably failing, stripping him of his mobility and forcing him into sterile medical wards with alarming frequency, the couple attained a level of unguarded presence that the Crown's suffocating protocol had previously outlawed. The Duke of Edinburgh permanently clocked out of his earthly shift on the 13th of April 2021 within the fortified walls of Windsor Castle. He had reached the staggering, monumental age of 100. He did not draw his final breath at Wood Farm, his beloved sanctuary of isolation. He perished exactly where he and Elizabeth had deliberately barricaded themselves against the plague, concluding their saga precisely side by side. The immediate aftermath of his demise is a devastatingly honest post-mortem of their entire relationship. Queen Elizabeth II, the most pathologically stoic and emotionally repressed constitutional instrument in modern European history, finally cracked. This was a woman who had glacially stared down global warfare, catastrophic economic crises, and spectacular familial embarrassments without blinking. Yet, this specific aristocratic bereavement entirely shattered her. The monarchy naturally forbade any public weeping, but the internal devastation was glaringly obvious to the terrified palace courtiers. Her immediate coping mechanism was to aggressively haunt Wood Farm. In the bleak months following his state funeral, the sovereign repeatedly commandeered royal helicopters to invade the Sandringham estate. She violently rejected the opulent comfort of the main house, opting instead to sleep within the Duke's rustic 6-bedroom ghost town. She actively sought out the painfully ordinary kitchen he had installed and the questionable amateur art he had plastered across the plasterboard. She deliberately anchored herself there around February 9, the notoriously heavy anniversary of her father's death. That specific calendar date carried terrifying psychological weight, marking the exact moment in 1952 when she inherited the suffocating crown and forced Philip into eternal subservience, forever sealing their shared captivity. She was not braving the Norfolk estate to escape the grief. She was intentionally bathing in it. One must critically analyse the sheer emotional masochism required to sit in the exact chair where your deceased partner found their only slice of earthly joy. She lingered in the mundane culinary space where they once cosplayed as a normal dishwashing couple whilst the brutal coastal winds battered the windows. That obsessive pilgrimage is categorically not the behaviour of a bitter woman who exiled a loathed husband to the countryside. It is the desperately tragic action of a grieving widow clawing at the fading shadows of her favourite human being. During the grim twilight between his departure in April 2021 and her own inevitable expiration in late September 2022, she treated Wood Farm as her personal Mecca. That unassuming rural property had mutated into sacred aristocratic ground. It stood as the only uncompromised monument to a marriage where the diamond-encrusted crown could be temporarily dumped in a drawer so two humans could actually breathe. What profound psychological lesson can the peasantry actually extract from this 5-year imperial saga? The modern populace is aggressively brainwashed by a nauseatingly specific brand of romantic success. The unwashed masses fetishize relentless proximity, worshipping the suffocating concept of couples who share every waking breath, every tedious errand, and every single cubic inch of oxygen. Society has pathologized independence to such a ridiculous extreme that occupying a separate mattress or holidaying in different time zones is immediately diagnosed as a catastrophic relationship failure. Yet, the late sovereign and her duke effortlessly torched every single one of those pathetic, clingy assumptions across 75 years of empirical evidence. From the very moment they acquired the keys to their first estate, they enforced a strict policy of divided sleeping quarters. They recognized early on that uninterrupted REM sleep, total psychological privacy, and basic human solitude are not the assassins of romance. They are its absolute bedrock. It is a biological impossibility to sustain affection when you are perpetually exhausted, chronically devoid of silence, and denied a sanctuary to drop your societal mask. When the Duke finally staged his 2015 retirement coup, he merely supercharged this brilliant philosophy by seizing an entire 6-bedroom cottage entirely for himself. The sovereign relentlessly ground through her constitutional sentences. They orchestrated regular, heavily guarded summits. They communicated consistently. They ruthlessly shared the microscopic moments that actually carried weight. Yet, the millisecond the global apocalypse of early April 2020 descended upon the realm, they violently merged their existences without a singular breath of hesitation. They devoured the ultimate year of the Duke's century-long life, breathing the exact same recycled castle air. The Princess Royal's brutal exposé is hardly a dull logistical briefing. It is a spectacular autopsy of an evolved, lethally mature romance. It is an affection entirely devoid of suffocating demands and pathetic dependency. I comprehend your exact neuroses, I recognise your absolute need for a vacuum, and I fiercely honour that even if it requires us to occupy entirely different postcodes, this detached devotion is infinitely superior to the nauseating, breathless codependency celebrated by the modern peasantry. It demands an obnoxious level of psychological security that the average civilian simply cannot fathom. The masses inevitably fail at this because they lack the aristocratic stamina to endure decades of ruthless observation. The sovereign and her consort possessed 75 years to map out each other's flaws, and they fiercely respected those boundaries until the grim reaper forcefully intervened. The Fleet Street scavengers were spectacularly, disastrously incorrect. One must aggressively underline the sheer audacity of their journalistic incompetence. For an absolute eternity, the British gutter press vomited out headlines equating geographical distance with matrimonial rot. They fabricated entire sagas of frosty estrangement and toxic festering resentment. They painted a pathetic portrait of a hollow alliance sustained purely for the sake of constitutional aesthetics. These parasites constructed an empire of lies upon a bedrock of deliberate, malicious ignorance. The psychological collateral damage was genuinely offensive. Every gullible civilian who consumed those toxic fables unconsciously degraded two titans who merited absolute reverence. These were monarchs who had entirely sacrificed their personal autonomy to the grinding machinery of the state. They had forged an alliance so utterly bulletproof that it could easily digest prolonged separation without a single microscopic fracture. Princess Anne's violent disgust towards this media circus is both glorious and intensely justified. Her bloodline was never estranged. They were simply highly evolved. The catastrophic failure of the public to grasp this distinction is a damning indictment of modern society's pathetic, romantic neuroses, rather than any structural flaw within the House of Windsor. The unvarnished reality is brutally straightforward. An alpha male who surrendered 60 years to public servitude earned his God-given right to isolate in utter peace. A sovereign chained to the throne relentlessly executed her mandate with terrifying precision and undeniable dignity. They possessed enough elite devotion to indulge their wildly divergent preferences well into their twilight years. Yet, the moment apocalyptic peril demanded absolute unity, they seamlessly locked shields. That is emphatically not the autopsy of a rotting union. It is the definitive blueprint of the most lethally effective partnership in modern geopolitical history. One must ruthlessly drill this final image into the collective consciousness. Following the Duke's demise on the 13th of April 2021, the sovereign obsessively hijacked his Norfolk sanctuary. She violently scrubbed plates in his aggressively ordinary kitchen. She aggressively occupied the 6-bedroom rural tomb he had curated. She blankly stared at the amateur watercolours he had slapped onto the plasterboard. She anchored herself to that miserable soil until at least February 9th, the brutally heavy anniversary of her accession. That specific date had irreversibly cemented the suffocating trajectory of their mutual captivity. She was a tragically ancient widow commanding the British Empire, yet she actively chose to freeze her aristocratic bones in a 6-bedroom agricultural shed. She subjected herself to this peasant architecture simply because it echoed with his final bursts of joy. Clinging to the damp walls of his chosen exile was the absolute closest she could get to his fading ghost. If that morbidly beautiful detail does not violently correct the tabloid narrative, humanity is entirely beyond salvation. The Princess Royal was spectacularly correct to drop this grenade on the press. The ignorant masses desperately required the severe education. The Duke and Elizabeth did not maintain separate postcodes because their vows were decaying. They deployed immense geographical distance because their alliance was terrifyingly invincible. It was sufficiently bulletproof to permit them the absolute luxury of unfiltered individuality. 75 years of segregated sleeping arrangements mutated into entirely distinct estates, accidentally spawning the most ruthlessly pragmatic romance of the century. One must now aggressively interrogate the public's inherent gullibility. It forces a brutal re-evaluation of every pathetic lie the masses eagerly swallowed from the tabloid scavengers. There is a deeply uncomfortable lesson buried within this Windsor saga that modern, suffocatingly codependent couples would do well to aggressively study. The dissection of this royal dynamic is far from concluded. If this ruthless demolition of tabloid mythology alters the collective perception of this formidable duo, then perhaps the unvarnished truth finally possesses more currency than cheap journalistic fiction. Stories of this monumental magnitude simply demand to be executed with unapologetic brutality.